Welcome to New Wineskins for Cenobitic Communities, an exploration of new legal and organizational structures. So once again, this is being brought to you by the Center for Benedictine Life at the Monastery of St. Gertrude. And so I think it'll be an interesting discussion today. We'll have presentation and then discussion, and I'm going to introduce you to I'm not seeing my own picture here.
But hopefully people can
yes.
see it.
So Mary Schmidt, who's my co-presenter today, and we're kind of doing some old-fashioned turning of the computer to so that we don't have to snuggle up too closely. So as I have generally done, I'm going to start with a little bit of Lectio today to kind of get us in the spirit, if you will, to begin to set a tone for what we're planning to do. This is going to be some Visio Divina. And what you see here is it's a picture, a painting of Lazarus being raised from the dead by Jesus. And so what I'd like you to do is to just spend some time, and as you look at it, I want you to see if you can think for your monasteries or communities, what are, some of the boxes, if you will, that are, reflecting on the boxes in your communities that are hindering new life the way they did Lazarus? What are some of the metaphorical boxes that are hindering life in your communities? And so we're just going to take a look at this, ponder it, reflect on it for about a minute and a half to get started. And we have a bell. Okay, so, just in the interest of time, we won't have a chance for discussion, but I love this picture because I think it kind of represents the reality of the institutions, the structures that have been confining often for our communities, our monasteries. And so that's really the theme of what we're going to be talking about today. Throughout these weeks, we've been talking about how the Center for Benedictine Life at the Monastery of St. Gertrude has been trying new things. And one of the critical pieces is that we are assuming that even if when there are no more vowed sisters, the community will continue. It'll just be continuing in new ways. And so that means we need new organizational structures to allow that to happen. The boxes, the structures that we currently have now, are starting to be confining and no longer life-giving, as in this picture. So now I think we all know that organizational structures are not one of those incredibly scintillating, great, exciting sorts of topics, but they're also really critical. They're kind of the infrastructure of any organization. So the difference, I think, between a bunch of well-meaning people who want to live Benedictine values and people who really live according to the rule is actually organizational structures. They don't have to be fancy, but they need to be there. And so things like corporations, organizational charts, boards of directors, all those kinds of things, again, may not tickle your fancy, but they're worth knowing and thinking about, and they're critical. So you'll also be relieved to know that I will not bore you to death with millions of details about why those things are critical. And I'm going to start with a disclaimer. The stuff that we'll be talking about today, in terms of what the Center for Benedictine Life is doing here, it's very much in process. This is not a done deal. We're not finished. We're having lots and lots of meetings, exploring with professionals, having consultations. So we're just, sharing what we're trying to do, what we're exploring, not giving you a roadmap of how you should do it too. So Jesus's image of wineskins is not part of our experience, is it? I suspect most of you haven't used a wineskin lately. I think maybe if he talked about boxed wine versus bottled wine, we might understand a little better. But basically, he's just talking about structures that don't fit. So what we've been saying in these last weeks is that traditional vowed religious life isn't attracting people the way it used to. Old structures don't work well with new ways and new realities. And that's what we're seeing in the so-called vocation crisis. But what I'm going to focus on is the idea of how Benedictine life and structures are lived out, because if we don't understand the concepts, then the rest of it isn't going to matter. So we have to understand that, again, the wineskins, if you will, of our new organizational structures have to fit this new reality, because if they don't, we will have new wine in old wineskins and, frankly, a mess on our hands when the skins don't work and they burst, as Jesus said. So the predominant model today, I think, in religious life, as it has been for a long time, is that the monastery has a superior, whether it's a prioress or abbot, who is really the equivalent of a CEO in any other kind of organization. That means that this abbot or prioress is handling everything from who's admitted to take vows to deciding what they're going to do to change the heating system, right? You know, they are essentially the final authority in pretty much every decision within a monastic community. So what happens is they end up being the CEO equivalent of $1 million organization. And at the same time, they're the ones leading prayer and deciding what to do about liturgy. So these tasks may be delegated, but the reality is the way all the structures are set up, you know, this religious superior is the final say-so. And there really isn't much of a way within these monasteries, their organizations are set up to do it any other way. So what that means is that really, you know, your basic monastery is kind of two organizations in one. So in other words, here on the left, you see the canonical monastery. Again, it's organized under Roman Catholic canon law. And a canonical monastery can only consist of vowed religious. There may be all kinds of good friends or oblates or other folks, but canon law doesn't recognize them. At the same time, simultaneously, you know, every monastic, you know, organization, every monastery is also a civil corporation. So in other words, it's a corporation under the law of the state or province where they're, you know, where they're physically located. And civil corporations, Idaho law, for example, doesn't really care who you are when you come up with a corporation. You get to decide. They don't require that everybody obviously be Roman Catholic religious. So what this means is that historically, and let's change the slide here, historically, monasteries have acted as if that civil corporation, you know, the one under Idaho or any other state or province's law, and the religious institute, you know, the Roman Catholic canon law part, are one and the same. You know, the prioress or the abbot is the head of the canonical monastery and is the president of the board of directors in the civil corporation. So they're, you know, again, they're kind of a dual entity. And the reality is monasteries, for the most part, operate as if there's kind of no daylight between those two. So after that, again, scintillating stuff, I want to see if you're still awake. You know, you might need to do a couple of jumping jacks there. So the question becomes, what happens then to this, you know, monastery that's also a corporation when you run out of vowed religious, whether sisters or monks? The reality is you got trouble right here in River City, don't you? Under this way of looking at things, pretty much all monasteries are operating, will be operating if they run out of vowed religious, they aren't going to have anybody to run the monastery because the civil corporation has been the same thing really as the religious institute. So no sisters or monks. Basically, you're going to run out of a corporation. There won't be any way to keep running it. But there's another possibility. So, as I said, historically, monasteries usually don't make clear, consistent distinctions between things that have to do with religious life and the things that have to do with any organization. The superior, again, as we've said, often leads prayer and approves the benefit packages for employees. There's no clear distinction. It all kind of gets mushed together. So given that, what we're trying to do here at St. Gertrude's is to begin to make a distinction between these two kinds of issues. And what we've begun doing is saying that there is sister stuff, which means things that come out of canon law, that come out of the reality of the religious vows we make, that commitment, and non-sister stuff. And non-sister stuff is frankly kind of everything else. In other words, examples would be non-sister stuff would be the business operations, the maintenance, the building, the staff, how they are supervised, paid, finances, everything having to do with money. Sister stuff, on the other hand, that's kind of a narrower box, really, because it has to do with obedience and permissions that wouldn't have any bearing for oblates or employees. It's the healthcare of sisters. What happens particularly with end-of-life care, that's different than you have for non-vowed people. Living situation, where people, get to live, that sort of thing. So, we see with formation, obviously, how is somebody brought into the community, the Cenobitic community? What training are they given, background in Benedictine life? So hopefully that begins to make a little bit of sense of how different those things are, even though they're not always treated differently. And so what we begin to see, just a second, get somebody in the waiting room here. So what we begin to see is that it's necessary to start to change, to pry apart, if you will, these two circles. Because without any distinction, we're going to end up in trouble, again, when you start to run out of people. So what we are trying to do here at St. Gertrude's at the Center for Benedictine Life is that we're beginning to make to distinguish these two, to, again, take them apart. And so you'll also notice that there's kind of a dotted line in the middle. And that's just the recognition that it's not always totally clear, especially when you've got systems that have been not clearly distinguished for a long time. It's going to take a while to kind of get those separated out. So, and this is a process that takes time. We've already been working at it, frankly, for a few years, and it's a huge conceptual shift to start thinking in terms of, wait a minute, is this issue kind of a sister thing? Is this a non-sister thing? Because unless you start to think of them differently, you're never going to be able to hand some stuff off to people who are not vowed monastics. Just because a sister runs a department doesn't mean that it's actually sister stuff. The person that takes care of the kitchen doesn't have to be a sister. The person who takes care of deciding somebody's new work situation for a sister has to be a sister. If you remember a while back, we asked, what happens when you run out of vowed religious, sisters or monks? And the answer is, of course, either you will come to completion, which takes incredible courage and integrity and a lot of work, or you need to figure out another way to continue your Benedictine organization. And that's really what we're talking about here, what we are trying to do, exploring. And so what we're planning here at St. Gertrude's is a number of steps, and I'll just explain them briefly, and then I'll have Mary Schmidt talk about more specifically some of what we're doing here. So remember we said that a civil corporation in any state or province can have basically whoever you want. So you can have, whoever you decide to have on a board of directors. It's your decision. So that means that what we're doing here at the Center for Benedictine Life at St. Gertrude's is setting up, exploring how to set up a new civil corporation that will have, can have members that are not necessarily sisters. The current civil corporation we have explicitly requires that everybody be a sister. Well, so we can have a new corporation that says that's much more flexible about that, doesn't require it the way it has been. So what that can mean, for example, is that at the beginning, you have a certain number of sisters and then gradually add lay people. It can take place over a long period of time. It can be kind of whatever you want. The state of Idaho doesn't really care how you do it. So the second thing is when we're looking at a different organizational structure, in other words, a different way of doing things so that the prioress or the abbot, isn't in charge of everything, we're looking at kind of a different organizational structure. So in other words, if we're talking about non-sister stuff, about employee benefits or, who's going to fix the roof or that sort of thing, that doesn't have anything to do with sisters or vowed religious. And so you can have a lay person who basically is the coordinator, kind of an equivalent of a CEO who does all of that, all of those issues. Again, it doesn't have to be a sister. So the other thing that we're looking at is that, and this is pretty critical, that these changes will be gradual. There won't be one big day and poof, everything changes. There's going to be lots and lots of planning, probably at least millions of meetings, plus consultations, help from outside sources to set up these new structures. So, for example, after we start a new corporation, most of the board of directors initially will be sisters with some lay people. Then over time, there'll be more and more lay people. So another thing, and just about done, as the number of sisters decreases and there isn't capacity for formal leadership among sisters or monks, the lay leadership of the corporation, this new corporation, will work with the federation, who are in the canonical structure that helps monasteries when they need help and to make sure we're all following the same directions. We'll work with them to make sure that all the provisions of canon law are being followed. And of course, to make sure that the explicit priority of the new corporation is care of the sisters. That's absolutely central. And then finally, eventually, again, after quite a while, the new leadership will be by lay people. And so this continuity of a Benedictine organization of this place, of this ministry of Benedictine spirituality will continue. Well, I'm going to turn this over to Mary Schmidt. And Mary has been an amazing person who has been an absolutely integral part of St. Gertrude's community for some time in a variety of ways. And she has a very special passion, really, for organizational structures, boards of directors. And so she's going to help explain more about where we're going in that regard.
Okay, great. So I'm assuming everybody can see me. Just because I can't see me, I'm assuming everybody else can, right? Okay, great. So to begin, I just want to refer back to the last slide that Sister Teresa showed in the very last concept, which said eventually all leadership will be by lay people. That statement, okay, first of all, we don't have a time frame for when is eventually. But that statement alone is usually a pretty scary thought for most women religious, for most of the sisters here. But the question is just, so who are these lay people that we're talking about? Well, here at the Center for Benedictine Life, we're not just looking for any lay person. I have served on several boards, as I'm sure many of you have, where we're grabbing a warm body to fill a seat. You don't think about who the next person's going to be until all of a sudden it's time. Let's grab somebody and let's move on. Well, that is not the approach that we have here at the Center for Benedictine Life to leadership. It is an honor to serve on the Center for Benedictine Life Board of Directors. It's an honor, and we will instill that value in individuals who serve in the culture of the board as a whole. People need to understand, future board members need to understand the significance of what they're doing, the significance to the continuation for the Center for Benedictine Life, even for the future expansion, and then the service that they give through this to the world. It's really important that we help people understand that. So it will be an honor. And so following then in the monastic tradition, it's going to take a long time. There will be much discernment and vetting of future board members. And so the board itself can only be as strong as the individuals who make that up. So we want really, really, really good board members. And that means member selection is going to be crucial. And it's going to be a year-round process. There'll be much prayer, discernment, orientation, ongoing formation, evaluation of individuals as well as the board. And so it's really essential when we think about the future here, the lay people who are going to be joining the sisters, it's really important that they understand the significance of this undertaking. And the other thing is that oftentimes or traditionally, boards spend a significant amount of time on what I call the product. What are the priorities, the programs, the ministry, the budget, the things? Okay, we spend a lot of time on that. But really, a truly effective board needs to spend just as much time on the process. In other words, how they are doing what they are doing, how they are doing what they are doing. You know, how are they working together as a board? How are they working with the committees that the staff have here at the monastery itself? How are we progressing in our own leadership? Those are crucial questions and crucial things that need to be dealt with and worked through if you really want to have a high-functioning team. So what might some of those characteristics then be when we start to look for potential leaders? Some of the characteristics that we're going to be looking for, particularly, they need to be steeped in Benedictine spirituality. And I mean really steeped, like a strong cup of tea in Benedictine spirituality. We're not just looking for people who think it's kind of interesting or religious people. We really are looking for those who have a commitment to this spirituality. And obviously, those who would come to the forefront, would probably be oblates, people who have gone through the cohort, our Benedictine cohort program here, potentially co-housing participants, but they really need to be passionate and committed to this Benedictine way of life. They need to also have a history or relationship here with the monastery of St. Gertrude. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't also have a history with other monasteries. Maybe the potential board member is actually an oblate at another monastery. That's not out of the question. But before they would be selected as a member of the board here, they would also need to have a relationship and a strong history here. The third thing then, again, going back to what Sister Teresa was just saying, they need to be committed to the care of the sisters. And of course, we expect that of the entire board, but we also want individuals to understand that commitment of this is how the board is going to operate. This is the number one goal or the number one priority, is that they must be committed to the ongoing care of sisters. They also need to be committed to this place and this space. And it's not like we're going to pack up and move the Center for Benedictine Life to Waco, Texas or somewhere. It's going to be here on this sacred space that has been prayed over and has maintained this monastery for such a significant period of time. And then, of course, we're going to be looking for people who have leadership capacity and good decision-making skills. And we will define that more into the future, what exactly that is. In fact, our sisters here at the monastery have already had some conversation among themselves about what are the characteristics that we would hope of future board members, future lay people who may become board members. And so that will play into how we start looking at the other factors of what we need. And then I would anticipate that future boards are going to determine that maybe they're looking for a specific skill set or certain personality or certain role when they look at future board members. And that will come and evolve as the board evolves into the future. So at this point, we don't have a specific timeline for this new civil leadership structure that we've been talking about and when it will be implemented. But if we know that eventually all leadership will be by lay members, eventually, then we need to bring it back to where we are right now. Because we need to be very intentional about starting the process of engaging lay people in leadership and leadership decisions now. Because, as Teresa mentioned, we want a slow transition as we move forward, so that when we no longer have sisters who are able to perform these leadership functions, we have a board, we have a group of people who are ready to seamlessly move in and continue on. There's not a lot of breaks and jumping around. It should be a very smooth transition. So the next slide, then, so here are some of the benefits for us moving, that's right, forward sooner rather than later. Don't wait till the last minute to implement this. Start bringing people on board, start engaging them now. The first one, of course, seems quite obvious. This allows lay people to learn from the sisters. While we have more sisters on a board than lay people, it's really important that lay people understand how the sisters operate, how things have been done. They learn the culture of Benedictine leadership. And probably one of the most important things, they develop trust. And that's really key, because we need to reassure all, particularly the sisters, but everybody, that lay people can be part of the Center for Benedictine Life here at the monastery, and they can be committed to the future and what happens here. The fourth thing then is that if we involve people sooner rather than later, it helps to ensure the Benedictine legacy, helps ensure that the sisters who have lived here and have lived Benedictine spirituality, that important life of Benedictine life continues for future generations, following in the legacy of Saint Benedict. All of you have been doing that, and this is continuing on, even though it may not be done quite as we thought it was going to be. And so it's not just actually the sisters here that they're continuing the legacy of. It's really the legacy of the Benedictine tradition that will continue for everybody. And then the last one I think is really important. It does help to minimize fear of the future. It's scary not knowing what's going to happen when we don't have sisters or that sort of thing. And so if we start doing this now, we can minimize fear. The sisters know what's going to happen. It's a plan that's been discerned and that they feel good about, and they can see, they'll actually be able to see that this is really working. So it will instill some confidence. So in a few minutes, we're going to open it up for questions, but there's one more concept that I just want to share. I'm going to turn to the next slide there. Even though Sister Teresa and I have been talking about these two kind of leadership structures, entities, or I say kind of leadership channels, one being the monastic community, the sisters under the direction of the prioress, and the other being the Center for Benedictine Life, eventually under the direction of a board of direction or a board of directors. The canonical community will be dealing with what Teresa calls the sister stuff. And then the Center for Benedictine Life would be dealing with and making decisions about the non-sister stuff. Those are two kind of parallel systems that will be working side by side and at times probably overlapping a little bit. But the ministries here at the monastery have always been very integrated into the monastic community, and we see that continuing. So both of those leadership channels are really under the broader umbrella of the Center for Benedictine Life at the Monastery of St. Gertrude. We're not thinking of, we're thinking of separating them, but we're not thinking of moving one off or, divorcing. Okay, we're still going to be under the Center for Benedictine Life working together. And it's just that we're following different channels or frameworks of leadership to do that into the future. So with that, Sister Teresa, do you have anything that you would like to add or share before we go to questions? Or
well, I'm so appreciative of everybody being willing to spend some time and to hang in there with, what is not, the most exciting topic, but an incredibly important one. And I hope that what we are doing in a pretty slow process is modeling maybe for other communities, again, a different way to think about this, a different way to enter into the future that hasn't been tried before, but I think we're finding can be. So what I'm kind of thinking is this is probably stuff that you might be more likely to have questions for us versus discussion in small groups. Shall we try that? And if there's too many questions or you just want to talk about it in a group, we can switch to that. How does that sound? So let's see, I think hopefully Julie can unmute everybody and then probably go down to the raise your hand. Trying to see where that is. Well, anyway. Okay, so yeah, let's see. Julie, you could unmute everybody.
I don't think we want to unmute everybody. They can unmute themselves as they want to ask questions.
Okay, that's a very good point. Yes, this is why there are technical directors. So yeah, if you have a question, sure. I just see Mary. Why don't you unmute yourself and we'll see what happens. You're not unmuted yet. So
You
Should-
mean me, Mary?
Here.
Okay, there
Mary
we,
White, yeah.
there we go, Mary White.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'd like to be the first one to say how excited I am about what you're doing and how grateful that so many of you have spent much time to bring us to this point. I think I know I and our sisters are passionate about wanting Benedictine spirituality continue for everyone who's attracted to it.
Mhm.
So while I just began my 80s, I'm not traveling around a lot, but I'm really going to be open to ways in which I can support this whole process. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful.
We really appreciate it. Yes, thank you.
There we
See
go.
if I can find who, oh, okay. Now we figured out where we're coming up. Yeah, let's see. Well, I'm not sure anybody's got their hands raised. It was just too exciting for everybody. Oh,
Janice Burry and Elise both have their hands raised.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
now I see them.
Okay.
I'll defer to Elise.
Yeah, Elise, you're muted. Yeah, we go.
Yes, I'm not now, am I?
No, no,
Yeah.
you're good.
Okay. I was wondering if you could address the process, or at least what it was like for you to, or whoever dealt with, I think it was you, Sister Teresa, dealt with on the canonical side. They have actually attorneys that you had to deal with. If other, how much difficulty there was or not, or anyway, a little bit of that process.
Sure, that's a good question. Yes, there are canon lawyers, the Roman Catholic Church has, hundreds of years of law and, legal process and that sort of thing. And so we've been working regularly, particularly with one canon lawyer who's also a Benedictine and who I think, understands kind of what we're doing, has worked with other communities. And I think nobody will be surprised that it's kind of complicated, particularly that, again, there are, canon law, civil law, they don't talk to each other. They don't recognize each other really. And so to try to make these things work is not simple, and we're still in process. So we, work some pieces out, and then we sort of get as far as we can and usually go back and say, okay, now what do we do? So it's still, still a process, and but we're gradually figuring it out, and we're charting new territory. So let's see, Janice, you had a question?
Well, I have a couple of questions. I just found out that you were doing these sessions, so I jumped in, and I don't think this is boring at all. I think it's really important. I've been trying to wrap my mind around how communities would do this. I'm a former member of St. Gertrude's. I left soon after you came to the community, Teresa.
Yeah, I remember.
But my spiritual heart is still at St. Gertrude's. Everything about St. Gertrude's just really has completely impacted the rest of my life. So I'm keenly interested in the future. So I'm just curious, do you know like how many other communities? I mean, it can't just be the United States and Canada, right? It's got to be around the world where communities are facing this whole thing of, do we close completely? Do we become something new? How experienced is the Vatican Church, not the small C Church, but the big C Church, at dealing with communities facing these questions and giving some assistance or being prepared to answer the questions that you are posing to the canonical lawyers. And then the other thing I was wondering is, has St. Gertrude's vowed community now closed formation, or are they still accepting postulates? If postulates is even the current term, I don't know if it's changed.
Yeah. Yeah, so good questions. I think that at least in most of the English-speaking world, the fall off in the number of vocations is pretty, universal or very common. Again, it depends, but for the most part, as far as kind of what Rome thinks about this, we are a very, very tiny little community. And, I think we're not on Rome's radar as far as I know. Although, again, we have been very careful, very consistent about making sure that we get, experience from canon lawyers so that, we are, honoring that system and, doing it in such a way that, we, again, are making sure that sisters are taken care of, which is usually kind of the really bottom line, as it should be for, for Rome, for the canon law system. Offhand, and please correct me if anybody knows, I don't really know anybody that's doing quite what we are. There are a lot of very interesting, creative endeavors happening. But I think that they seem to be a little bit different than what we're doing. As far as our formation, we have not made any explicit decisions, but at this point, we haven't had a vocation director for, it's been about 3 years. We don't really have a formation director. And so, we simply aren't focusing on that. We have amazing other people that are, coming to join us in new ways. And so that's what we're, again, we're focusing on. So hope that makes some sense. And let's see, I think, Don, yeah, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm a clergyman in the Episcopal Church. I'm also an oblate of many years. And the thing that worries me here is that in some cases, lack of an interfaith or an a community that's welcoming people from other Christian faiths. And that, one of the things about that is that I have been to a number of different monasteries, both male and female. And there is a big difference there about how welcome one is in certain areas of this country. Then secondly, as we go into this thing, it seems to me, and I'm not trying to downplay this at all, I think what's going on here is absolutely fabulous. Will this convert from a Cenobitic formation to a lay formation eventually? And if that's going to happen, I think it's essential that other faiths, if you will, somehow can have a worm into this thing, and that it's going to have to come up in Rome at some point.
Okay. So I think, first of all, one of the things that has been absolutely central to who we are at St. Gertrude's for a lot of years is to be as absolutely welcoming as possible of people from all faith backgrounds, all backgrounds in general. That's central to who we are. Obviously, in the past, anybody who has come to be a vowed sister needs to be Catholic. That's a given. But, our new co-housing endeavor, which we'll have a presentation on next week, is ecumenical. all of our programs at our retreat center are ecumenical. Our guests come from all kinds of backgrounds. We are very, want to be careful in case Rome is listening. We're really pretty open in how we practice certain things. I'll kind of leave it at that. And I think you're absolutely right about formation being absolutely critical. And I guess, the way I see it is I think because Benedict predates all of the current schisms within the church, that, to have Benedictine formation isn't, a special track for the Protestants and another track for the Catholics or something. This is an inheritance of the universal church. And so, in all the programs on Benedictine spirituality I've done, for the most part, it just doesn't come up because I think it transcends the divisions that we have. So hopefully that kind of covers it a little bit. Okay, and so I think next, Marie from Australia.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that thank you for your presentation. It isn't boring at all. But just from, I'm an oblate of the Sisters of the Good Samaritan of the Order of St. Benedict in Australia. And I have to say that that the Sisters of the Good Samaritan have been on this path for quite some time. And I can't speak with any expertise on the background of it because I haven't been in those circles, so to speak. But they do have, and have had for quite a number of years, a director of operations for the sisters. They have people working in safeguarding and even the spirituality and mission animation leader. So I can see as you're speaking that they have been on this path, and as you say, it's a gradual path, and I can see also where the oblates have been on this path also, and so yes, thank you.
No, thank you. It's good to know. Sounds like I'll have to be in touch with Sonia and some of those folks to see what they've done. So that's good to know. It's kind of hard to share some of this information around the world. So that's why these things are so good. See, a couple people had their hands raised, and I'm going to see if I can find them. Let's see if Julie knows who's raised their hands, because I'm not seeing it.
There's no one right now.
Okay, there were two. Okay, so anybody else? Your last chance for all those things you always wondered. Okay, and Marie Moore, would you just unmute yourself? Here we go.
Good morning, everyone. And I'm also an oblate with the Good Samaritan Sisters of the Order of St. Benedict in Australia. Just to add to Mari's commentary, the sisters also, I have recently retired from health and wellbeing role with the sisters, and it was a national role supporting the sisters through their health issues, which was something that the congregation had identified well over a decade ago. So as Mari mentioned, they're certainly on this journey, and they have brought quite a number of lay people into their organisational structure, basically. So thank you.
That's helpful. It's so good to have some resources and models out there of folks that are doing this. Let's see if there's anybody else, and then Dawn, if there's not.
Saint Scholastica.
Okay. Saint Scholastica, why don't you just unmute and we'll get your question. There we go.
I was just wondering if like this model could work if the sisters continue, if there always continue to be a few sisters, or not, right? Is that the model? Is it like But it's not like there would be two corporations. That's not what you're envisioning. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think, and again, nothing's real, it's all set in jello and not in stone, but yeah, we're envisioning a single corporation. And, chances are, the way what most monasteries are finding is that, we're kind of on a decreasing path, if you will, of the number of sisters who can provide leadership. And so this will be a way to, again, a gradual shift. As there are fewer sisters, there may be enough for a council, but not a prioress, that sort of thing. So this would gradually increase the number of lay people, while at the same time the number of sisters is decreasing, so that eventually the canonical community would probably have a administrator when there wasn't able to be an elected prioress or even eventually a council. So, you've got kind of two parallel tracks that are going to be going on for a while. Hopefully it makes a little bit of sense.
Right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. I'm going to go to Priscilla and then Dawn. If there's nobody else, I'll come back to you. Priscilla, just unmute. Yeah, Priscilla. Okay, there you go. You got it.
Sister Priscilla, I'm Oblate Director at Sacred Heart Monastery in Coleman. And I just want to say, oh gosh, you've done a lot of work on this, and the plans are certainly helpful for any monastery, any community. We're all going through planning. We may not be, ready for what you're doing yet, but that really helps. And I think it gets our brains working. I just have one question for the board of directors, for lay board members. You do have some now, and how's that going? Or you don't have any yet? That's just the plan. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all happening in monastic time, which is
okay.
Yeah. So let's see, MT, why don't you go ahead?
Well, Teresa, you asked if there was any other monastery that was doing anything like you. And I have to tell you that Sister Claire, who was the previous prioress, and then I followed her, we had a wonderful talk with Mary Foreman in 2019, and she inspired us to move in this direction. And so 2019, we made a statement, we call it a big, hairy, audacious goal right now, to, in 2051, which is 30 years out, that we will be a non-canonical group of people that will continue to carry out the mission, the values, and the charism of Benedictine life here on Bennett Lane here in Colorado Springs. So we too are on this road, as you are, and you really all get the credit because of Mary Foreman, because she was the one that talked us through and shared with us what you're doing. We too are right now. When I became prioress, I was able to add 2 people to quote my monastic council, and I'm not allowed to call them council members, but I'm allowed to call them council advisors, and they're permanently on the council. One is an employee and one is an oblate, and we're going to be adding a third one in the summertime, who will probably be what we call a Sunday assembly member. So, I've been really interested to hear this and see how you're doing. And you get all the credit. You really do. And we are, one of the things we've been challenged with by LCWR is remember that your vowed professed commitment is a sacred gift in itself. And when the last sister dies, you will have come to fulfillment. And like I said, you're kind of soft pedaling that, you're not saying it completely in your audacious goal. And they're right. We are. But that's partly because we're bringing 20 sisters along in discernment And even though that's what we've said, we got a lot of work in the next 5 to 10 years, as you have acknowledged, to really make this happen graciously. And it's not going to be without mistakes, but we're really trying to take it slowly, but also be really aware of the big question is leadership. Will we have leadership in the professed membership? And we think we have one more round. I just was elected a little less than 2 years ago. So we're trying to be realistic. And that's hard. It's painful, but we just had a wonderful 2 days together, our community meeting, and we heard stories from each other that were just so profound. And I believe that is going to give us the impetus to stay faithful to each other. And it's also going to keep us faithful to this goal that is some days daunting, to be very honest. But, so that's thank you. And I know I can't thank Mary Foreman. I already did when she was at the Prior's meeting this year. Great woman. And your community is, you get the vision highlight award. So thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you, MT. That's just, it's inspiring to hear what y'all are doing. Yeah, it's just wonderful. And I think we're beginning to get maybe a little group that we can bounce ideas off each other from Colorado to Australia. So it's just wonderful to hear what you're doing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So Barb, please go ahead.
I too appreciate all that you have presented here. I'm a sister from the House of Bread in Canada. And it's really interesting to me to hear what you have to say. Much of what you have said, we have implemented already. And I think it's largely because we're a smaller community and we could move perhaps more quickly. Nor do we have large or any kind of ministries at this point because we're all retired and inactive. Our situation varies very differently from yours because while we have many of these pieces in place already, we are 7, we're older, and we're not going to be continuing. We will be coming to completion. And the way in which we're set up now will help that tremendously achieve what it is we are after. And I have to say, it works really well. In Canada, we have an advantage of having a group that really does assist communities who are moving toward closure or fulfillment. So we had an advantage of having much of this already in place and for us to learn from and then implement into our own situation. And so we have, it was just really fascinating for me to see what you've listed because and to see how it compares to what we have implemented as well. So I think it's probably the direction that things are just moving generally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've, long so admired what you've done there at House of Bread, to be just very creative, to keep moving. And, you are lucky, the CRS services that you have in Canada that are really, from what I can tell, pretty spectacular and just give you some of that extra support. But yeah, again, you all have been such a model of how to very gracefully come to completion or fulfillment is a much better word in a very gracious way and as a model for all of us. So thank you for what you're doing and for sharing it. So let's see if okay, I think I know that Dawn, I think had another question.
Yeah, just the thing that hits me is I was introduced to Benedictine life through getting involved with the rule. And obviously, where we are going, the rule is going to be difficult for avowed people or vowed people to live as, or more difficult than it is today. Is there any thought somewhere in the whole women religious, or at least Benedictine men or women, to interpreting the rule for a postmodern society, or has that not been addressed yet?
You've just hit on my passion, actually. So I'll try to restrain myself a little bit, but yes, I think that's somewhere beyond critical, and I think the trick is kind of expanding on that, and finding mechanisms to do that. And in particular, what I often think is there's a need for something that's in between the traditional academic study, exactly what did the master say and what was the Latin, and a very, very broad thematic kind of study that, that pays tribute to the rule, but doesn't enter deeply into the rule. I think there's kind of a third way that's needed of how do we, as 21st century, people in industrialized country, read this rule, in a way that applies not just to canonical religious, but applies to folks that will never be part of formal religious life. And yet, there's incredible application to anybody everywhere. And so I think that's a huge unmet need. It comes under the category of in my spare time. But I think, I would just give a shout out to everybody who's doing it, and to say that, yeah, that's critical. And it's seems to be a not necessarily a well-met need at this point. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And let's see, I think Saint Scholastica had their hand up, I understand.
Yes, hi. I'd like to thank Sister Mary Foreman actually for having the vision and sharing it with everybody. My question is, with all the other communities that have mentioned that you've already started this, how long did the community adjust to the thought and actually act on it?
I'm not sure I got the last part of that.
My question is, how long did the community, your communities, adjust to the vision of actually acting on it and actually, really moving toward it, acting on, reaching the goal of.
Okay, yeah, I got it. I didn't quite hear it. That's a good question. It really depends on how far back you want to say this began. In some ways, I think it began when we started emphasizing that our oblates were a part of us, that they weren't a program, they were a community, they were part of the St. Gertrude's community. Another big piece was when we very first began talking about the idea of having a co-housing community. And so it has been in progress really for a number of years. A big event, kind of not formal, but certainly informal affirmation happened about a year ago when we had a day when we invited all the sisters, our employees, a whole bunch of our oblates, and really kind of to all of them introduce this idea of that we're the Center for Benedictine Life at the Monastery of St. Gertrude. So that was a key turning point, but it was a lot of years to get to that point. And I mentioned that not to discourage anybody, but to say that as I've kind of emphasized, there are such underlying conceptual, thinking that has to change in order to begin to get to the point where you're dealing with legal structures. Unless people begin to see Benedictine life in a whole new model, a whole new paradigm, if you will, then, then this won't work. And changing people's way of thinking, their worldview, is not fast. So, I'm not even sure when we could say it started, but it's been quite a few years.
Yeah, because my concern is like also, the transitioning, like you said, the mindset of the sisters needs to, we really need to gradually, shift our mindset to the new, how it is and how where it's going.
Yeah.
To the reality, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only thing I can say is hopefully, I think as pretty much all of our communities get smaller, as we see what's happening, people might be more open than they were, 10 years ago. But to know that it's a lot of work, it's a lot of gradual work. It's possible, but yeah, I don't want to ever discourage anybody, but know that without changing people's minds, how they understand things, you can't just impose actions. So I'm kind of aware that it's already almost 2:45, and we usually go about an hour. It's been a little over. So I am deeply, deeply appreciative of everybody's willingness to give up part of their Sunday, to ask good questions, to share what's going on around the world. This has been very helpful. And you want to add anything?
No, I just want to say I'm very impressed with all the interest that I see with people interested in what's happening here and interested in how that fits with their communities too. That's great.
Yeah, so next week, be sure to tune in, as we used to say. We'll be having our final session on the co-housing community that's in formation. So that should be really interesting. It's going to be led by a couple of the women who have been the foundational people in getting this going. So thank you, and blessings on Ascension Sunday, and hopefully see you next time.